to a multi-party elections, and some recognitions of rights and some of the prison people, political prisoners type of thing. So the deal was not at that time that costly to President Assad and his government. And I remember that even there were some bureaucrats that went as personal envoys of these president and prime minister to help design the process and planning of this the reform process and what type of planning or designing that needed. However, President Assad and Syrian government, after promise, for them, it turned out at the end, this was a method of making time and gaining time. So each time after a meeting, they would get another 2-3 weeks on their table, and it seemed that they were working on something, but they never delivered on those promises. And Assad and his government used all of these Turkish initiatives. And while the Turkish government was heavily criticized by outside, by especially our Western allies, that we were helping the Assad regime to gain time and to prolong the crackdown, Turkey was hopeful, and this was almost until the end of August. But somewhere around August, Syria has lost Turkey in this process. And at the end of August, after several initiatives failed, Turkey shifted its Syrian policy and started to support the demands of the Syrian people and basically close relations with the Syrian government ended. Turkey, by then, in the meantime, opened its borders to the refugees, what is called in the Turkish press and by the Turkish government jargon as our guests. And a number of these people reached at some point to 17,000, even though right now they are less than 10,000. And they made cities around the border on the Turkish side for them. And by the end of September, even though Turkey has allowed the opposition groups and representatives to meet earlier in Antalya and Istanbul, by mid-September, Turkey was practically helping them to organize the opposition groups. Even though the Turkish Prime Minister has announced in New York, when he came for the United Nations Summit, that the Turkey would start taking unilateral steps imposing certain sanctions, the Turkish government still waited and gave time, what we know as the Arab League initiative. So the Turkish government practically closing the airspace for the military purposes, other than practically did nothing. So that is basically another opportunity for the Syrian government to take that chance of the Arab League. Now, in the meantime, obviously, we are observing in the press, and especially from the Western press, some pressures and some encouragement for Turkey to take some unilateral actions. And Turkish government resisted them and waited, and Prime Minister Erdogan, even though he announced several times publicly that he will go and visit those camps in the border, he delayed that visit until now, and so that this Arab League initiative would start on a clean page, so to speak, that the Turkey would be on one side and the Arab League would be on, they wouldn't face a situation that the Arab League would be on another side. Actually, the Arab League initiative provided some benefits for Turkey also, because in Syria, the current government, when they understood that this was, Turkey started to pressure and shifted its policy towards the opposition, they put it as if an outside force is interfering in the domestic affairs of Syria, and this was Turks versus Arabs, this is Turkey versus Syria. So when the Arab League initiative came at the beginning of November, this was probably after the Turkish initiatives, this was the greatest opportunity for the Syrian government to take an exit without making the things much worse. But as we all observed all together, the Syrian government did not take that one, and that is where we are today. And as all of you know, yesterday the Arab League plus Turkey, that is how it is called, because Turkey has a special relationship with Arab League. It is not a member of Arab League, but the Prime Minister joins their meetings, and this was even before the Syrian events have started. This is a cooperation matter between the Turkey and Arab League. So that yesterday, Arab League announced very serious economic sanctions, and there were some words by the Qatari Prime Minister and Prime Minister that these sanctions were taken to prevent a military intervention. That was an interesting observation. And the second one was that the sanctions should be supported by the United Nations. So we know all of the entire route that the Libyan sanctions have taken and how it moved from one level to another level. In the case of Libya, I'm not saying that this will be similar, but I will not be surprised if the United Nations take similar actions of sanctioning the Syria, the similar economic sanctions. And United States and the European Union already have taken certain measures in terms of economic sanctions. Now, I would like to touch upon certain subjects that I think I should observe, and then I will answer some questions. Now, dear friends, unlike other Arab countries where the Arab Spring is taking place, Syria, even though each country is unique and different, Syria is much different in terms of its spillover effects to the entire region. You see, Egypt is the most populated Arab country, and you can, for most of the Arab countries, it is the leader of the Arab League and this and that. But what happened in Egypt, it is an Egyptian thing. It does not have probably a very little amount of spillover to Palestinian and Gaza, and in Egypt-Israeli relations, the rest of the region, other than either a motivation or a role model, does not have direct foreign policy consequences or security consequences. Now, obviously, I mean, Tunis and Libya, they are mostly an event within those countries. But Syria, unlike any of those countries, or I should say probably more than all of those countries, something happens in Syria that has tremendous consequences for the entire region. And it is Iran, it is Iran's sphere of influence, it is the security threats that poses to Turkey because of the 910 kilometers borders, either a civil war or a sectarian war, and especially on the matter of Kurdish issues. Israel and Israel's northwestern border at the Golan Heights, and it has been a very quiet border for so many years. So the Syrian, a fitna, chaos, a civil war in Syria has much bigger consequences in the entire region than any of the other Arab Spring countries. And actually, the President Assad's government knows about this and knows about the region, and they take power out of this threat that if something happens to us, then this will be the entire region. So this is, and as Syrian citizens, where this understanding puts the entire Syrian population is beyond the question. Now, I would like to, but this is also, you need to keep in mind that United States is withdrawing from the region, from Iraq, and within a month, and then that withdrawal by itself, even with all the stability and security in the region frozen, has tremendous consequences for the instability in the region. Now, add that to a chaos in Syria. That is why this area is tremendously difficult, and there is no good solution at all. Now, keep in mind that Iran and Turkey, even though good economic relations, because Iran and Turkey depends on energy sources, both natural gas and oil, partially to Iran. On the issue of Syria, they are in the opposite ends. Definitely, Iran is probably the most strong supporter of Syrian regime, And this relationship has been there, even though, I mean, Syria was an Arab country. On the Iran-Iraq war, Syria was on the Iranian side. There are some sectarian similarities. And keeping the regime in Damascus intact helps Iranian policies tremendously. And that is why, I mean, currently China and Russia also supports the Syrian regime, but their support is not comparable to Iranian support. You need to also keep in mind that in the last 7-8 years, because of the situation in Iraq, there are different reports close to 1.5 to 2 million refugees from Iraq went to Syria. And that is, Iraqi government is not comfortable with that. Something happens in Syria, those refugees will be flooding back to Iraq. And so Lebanon is also another case, and I don't want to dwell on this one also, but for the entire region, there are consequences of what is going on and what will be happening in the region. Now, one of the soft spots for Turkey, it has been discussed in the press, almost in analysis, on the Kurdish issue, and the chaos, the civil war in Syria, how it will affect the Kurdish issue in Turkey. Now, it is not a secret that Syria has provided safe houses to PKK, the Kurdish organization who fought with the Turkish government and, in the 1990s. And in those safe houses, the PKK leadership were living. And only a threat of serious war was able to change the minds of the Syrian government to send Öcalan out of the country. And in the last few months, probably since the beginning of summer, we can see a renewed relations between the Syrian Mukhabarat, which is the intelligence agencies, and the PKK in terms of a regional cooperation. Even though the leaders of the Turkish government, they are cautious in their statements regarding the Syrian support of PKK. There are a lot of reports on the board, on the press, on the analysis of this cooperation. Obviously, this is a very sensitive issue for security reasons, and for somebody to harm Turkey, that is the most soft spot perceived from a security perspective. Now, I would like to say a couple of words in terms of a sectarian divide over here, because as you all know, a Sunni-Shia conflict, which is one of the major fault lines in the region, and usually provoked by both Iran and Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf countries, is a great source of instability in the region. And again, I will repeat myself, Iran and some of the countries in the Gulf, they might have some interests to promote this sectarian divide, and it might serve to their interests. But it is absolutely the interests of Turkey to see the things and to run a policy based on the sectarian divide. For over 40 years, Syria was ruled by a Nusayri Alawite minority population, and Turkey is a predominantly Sunni Muslim country. These are known facts now, and it was known 5, 6, 7 years ago when the same government was intact over there and the same people was over here. So Turkey has tremendous experiences in its past dealings with both Lebanon and Iraq, that if you sign and ally yourself with one sect or with one ethnic group, you can never contribute fully to your potential into any political process, and you can never influence the outcome. Now, buffer zone safe havens. There are calls and analysis about this buffer zone and the safe zones. Turkey has resisted them, even though the Turkish government said that they might be on the table as an option, but definitely not now, and they specified unofficially some conditions that when that could be used as an option. Turkey is against the outside military intervention. This is not an option, and expectation is that with the economic sanctions and the political pressure, the system in Syria would not be able to survive. Now, I would like to say a couple of things about Arab League's initiatives and there are certain lines of the Turkish policy, but I'll leave them to the questioning because Kilic is telling me that I'm up with my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before opening the floor for questions, I will just ask a few questions to the panelists, and I will give them an opportunity to respond if they want to each other's speeches. And my first question is where Erol Bey left, actually, about the Arab League initiative and the sanctions. In political science literature, there has been a debate on do sanctions work argument. So according to some people, they work really well, and they can appease or they can convince government to act otherwise, but in some other cases, it proved that it didn't work. And about the Arab League sanctions, do you believe that it will work or not? Can they be successful with the framework that they approved yesterday? And my second question is about the negotiated transition theory, if I can call it so, midwife democracy theory, that Helena Cobban put forward. And would you clarify this theory a little bit? Who should be convinced first for this plan? And from Erol Bey's, Mr. Cebeci's statement, we learned that Turkey's attempt to negotiate the transition actually didn't work out. So what will make a negotiated transition successful in case of Syria? And finally, one more question to you. Henry Kissinger once said that there cannot be war in the Middle East without Egypt and peace without Syria. And considering your expertise in the peace process, can you tell us a little bit about the possible implication of the events in Syria on the peace process, if there will be error? Thank you.
Some very small questions.
Sure.
I'll answer them as quickly as I can. I just want to make one note about sanctions, which is that sanctions are necessarily punitive in intent. And unless there is a political horizon, a political roadmap to which they are directed, then they can last for many years, as we saw in Iraq. They lasted for 13 years and resulted in the death of perhaps 500,000 children. We don't want to go down that route. If there are sanctions, they should be directed toward a goal. So I can see, sanctions and the sanctions that have already been applied and the ones that are threatened being perhaps helpful in persuading the Assad regime that they need to get into this negotiated transition. Just as the white South African regime was persuaded by international sanctions to get into democratization there. So that answers two of your questions. The sanctions question and how we persuade Assad. The effects of the Arab Spring on the peace process, I've written quite a lot about it on my blog, but basically the fall of the Mubarak regime in Egypt was a huge plus for the pro-justice forces in the Middle East. And in particular, in 2005, 2006, there was a series of elections in Egypt and Gaza and the West Bank that all were kind of then countered by an attempt by Mubarak and the West and Israel to annul the effects of the elections. Now the election in Egypt is being reheld, and that will bring about a very different outcome than what happened in 2005, 2006. In Syria, there are, as I recall, maybe 500,000, maybe many more Palestinian refugees, and some of them have been very vulnerable to regime repression. I mean, they've always been vulnerable to regime manipulation and repression. But recently they've been even more vulnerable. At the same time, you have had the Hamas leadership there operating under a transactional relationship with the regime. I think the Hamas leadership can go almost anywhere that it wants at this point. It could go to Cairo, in a few months. It could go maybe even back to Jordan. The loss of Damascus as a safe haven for Hamas, I don't think is fatal to Hamas. So I don't know that this affects the peace process in any particular way, except that it restates the importance of individual human rights for Arabs throughout the whole region. And that includes Palestinian Arabs. It includes Palestinian Arabs who live in the West Bank and Gaza, and those who have been refugees from their homes for more than 60 years now. So, you know, if you can say that the Arab Spring has reaffirmed the importance of the Arab individual rights, then that's the effect it's going to have. I'll leave.
A couple of things. If you ask, when I ask myself, what is this Arab Spring about, and I have to define it with one word, the words that come to my mind, it is a delayed process, and it is dignity of the people, and it is a way that people in the Middle East is no different, and people in the Arab countries and the Muslim countries is no different than any other countries in the world, that they want a better life for themselves and a better life for their children, and more oxygen to breathe, and to be free and prosperous. So, can Syria become a Sweden down the road in 2-3 years, or Switzerland? I seriously doubt that, because I believe it takes time. This entire change process takes time. But I think the process is irreversible, and I am inherently, I'm an optimist person, and I'm optimistic even though I know the risks for the country and for the population, for the region. Now, I wanted to say that before getting into any specific questions. Can sanctions work? Obviously, sanctions by themselves is a tool, it is not an objective. Otherwise, I don't think anybody who enforces sanctions enjoys pressuring somebody, and that is a tool to make sure, to expect that somebody is acting in a certain way. And in this case, this tool is used to pressure the Syrian government that once they do not have enough income from oil and from other revenues, then they will not be able to pay this closed circuit of the people, so that you can peel off layer by layer that side. So that is one of the things. And the President Assad, who feels very strong that he doesn't have to concede in anything and can crack down and kill as many as he wants to, would feel that this will not be done that way because he's not as strong as that one. And I hope that he will come to a table where he will negotiate a possible political outcome, which I think personally, instead of one more person, innocent person dying in this process, you let go an entire family of Assad family and his cronies free or exile or whatever it is, so that the people in Syria could have their country and go on with the process. Now, but it has also, the sanctions might also can work. So far, when you analyze the case in Syria, that a lot of people in the smaller cities are joining part of the demonstrations, but especially the business classes of Aleppo and Damascus, they stayed out of this thing because they don't want to risk, and they want to see more clearly who will be on the winning side. So because they know that if they switch sides, and then if Assad stays, there will be very serious consequences for them. So the weakening of Assad's regime by lack of income and by these measures, the sanctions, would help probably a lot of people to rethink their position and switch sides. Now, midwife theories to democracy, I agree with that you need a third party to communicate with both sides. And it could be, and I personally, I do not think that since Arab League countries, their own record of democracy is not that great, and everybody admits that even they themselves, that they should not be in the position of midwife. I think that is a very noble idea, but it is probably in the ongoings of the real world. As long as there is a midwife and there is a birth was done healthy, I don't really care the qualities of or the personal lifestyle of the midwives. Now, this Arab League initiative, I think it still had some chance. Now, even though Arab League is known as a toothless and cannot do anything, has never done anything, and with all these criticism, because for my friends in the audience know that this is the Syrians. They are a proud nation, and they are a proud Arab nation. And the Arab League's initiative would have some influence on the army, and because there are certain details on the declarations that it talks about the opposition to coming to Arab League headquarters, and so it motivates a lot of other people and a lot of the players in this arena to make easier for them to pick sides and to change or to reevaluate their positions. And I'm hoping that this will be the case. Just before I stop, I just wanted to say that Turkish policy in Syria, Turkey has insisted since the beginning that there should be a local and regional solution to this problem. That is not a Western military intervention. Now, this Arab League offer provides that platform, a local and regional solution to this problem. Turkey, since the beginning, insisted that the territorial integrity of Syria, as it was in the case of Iraq and in other countries, and this should be a policy objective of any solution. And we know for a fact what is the cost of a sectarian war, a civil war, and this is Iraq is very close to Turkey. And everybody in the region knows that. And unfortunately, even Assad knows that, what type of a fear it creates. So he calculates every day how many people he can kill without getting serious trouble. Now, preventing a civil war at any cost will be Turkish government's objective in this endeavor.
Thank you very much. And now the floor is open for questions. Please identify yourself.
Jared Cotto, Public International Law and Policy Group. So this question is for you. What do you believe in the short-term Turkey's relationship with the Free Syrian Army is going to be?
I have read the analysis on the press of the so-called Colonel Assad of the Free Syrian Army, when he said that Turkey was helping them to organize, but was not providing any equipment and material, and I will take his word for that, because I know when he gives numbers, he has in the position to exaggerate. If he was getting equipment and military hardware, I'm sure he would make that announcement publicly. So Turkey consistently is providing a platform for the opposition in Turkey to organize, while it is trying to support a unified and multi-party opposition. It is in the short run, I don't think Turkey will provide any military equipment or hardware or training for the army. But with people who comes from the army to Turkey, Turkish border has been open since May, and it is open to everybody, both civilian and military. And other than that, if you ask my personal opinion, I think Lebanon is a much better place for the Free Syrian Army, because I've followed the news also, what is the military hardware and how it is sold, because Turkey is not conducive to that. If only anybody can do that in Turkey, it is just the Turkish government, and at this point the government says that they are not doing, and I will take their word.
Hi, I'm Anthony Smith from the New Zealand Embassy. I have questions about two scenarios. The first one is we've heard this talk about maybe civil conflict fitna, and it's quite easy to make comparisons to Lebanon and Iraq. I just want to tease that out a little bit more. I suppose the question I would have around that is that Lebanon and Iraq are quite different to each other, and it probably stands to reason that Syria would be different again. One of the big differences that we might see in Syria is that the percentage, the ethnic breakdown of the population is quite different to, say, Lebanon, where you had several communities vying for control. And I think another feature of Syria is we talk about the Alawite regime, but it's really a section of the Alawite community. So to what extent is the entire community dragged along with the regime in the minds of the Syrian public? So that's one question around what civil breakdown might look like in Syria. And then the second scenario question is about this, trying to persuade Assad to have some kind of transition. Now, I mean, all attempts on this have failed to date, and we have to assume that a midwives of democracy idea might equally fail. And if it does, and if there is civil conflict, then what are the options? So I would like both speakers to address that. Are we really looking at a Libya kind of option, which would in fact involve Western countries, even though I think both of you are skeptical of involvement from those countries. And if I can also raise the issue of countries that come out of wars looking for more wars, I mean, we could also argue that in fact they try to avoid becoming entangled in future conflict. So the idea of the Pentagon looking for another conflict to find. And you could argue that Vietnam actually caused the United States to avoid a number of conflicts. But anyway, that's these are hypothetical questions, and I'd be grateful for your answers.
Okay, well, I'll take on the question about the different demographic profile of Syria and how the fact that you have one, essentially I think what you were saying, I mean there's one large group which is the Sunni Arabs, and then there are a lot of small groups of which the Alawites are one, and how that's different from Lebanon certainly, and to a certain extent different from Iraq. I suppose it makes it very like South Africa, actually, where the whites were 11% and they were monopolizing power for all those years, and they tried to co-opt, various other groups and play divide and rule, which they did, for many decades, playing on ethnic differences as well as skin color differences. But at the end of the day, they came to the realization they needed to negotiate. Now, I don't doubt, in fact I know, that Assad and the regime play upon the fears of fitna in order to try to keep the loyalty of, Christians and all kinds of minorities, people who are not Sunni Arabs. And there are also considerable differences within the Sunni Arab community, as Erol referred to a little bit. I mean, you have the rich merchants and you have the poor, impoverished farmers. Remember that Syria has actually had 5 years of very severe drought, and rural communities and lifestyles have been majorly demolished, destroyed throughout the country. And so you have a lot of dispossessed rural people clustered around the cities, as has happened in Tunisia and Egypt, and that's been a major driver of the Arab Spring. Whether that means that we could just stare down President Assad and say, you claim that there's a fear of fitna, we think that's not the case, we think that you're manipulating it, therefore submit to majority rule now. I mean, I don't think that's the nature of the negotiation. I think they do have valid reasons to be afraid as Alawites, and I don't think it's just, the coterie around the president. The way these things work, whether you're talking about the Balkans or Lebanon, I lived in Lebanon for 6 years and I saw it happen. I saw how people's identities, even people who have mixed marriages, or who seem to be modern and secular, once you get into one of these cycles of sectarian or ethnic hatred, there's been a lot of writing about this in the Balkans, how it sort of brands you on your forehead whether you want it or not. And I think that's probably happened to the Alawites with a few notable exceptions, individual exceptions at this point. They see themselves, and I think many Christians see themselves in Syria beleaguered. Remember that most of the Christians from Iraq had to leave Iraq and are now in Syria. I mean, this thing is, it's very lively and difficult for Christians in the Middle East. So they don't take it lightly. So I think there are genuine fears that need to be addressed, and that's why you need the external midwife, because you're not going to get the two parties just sitting down and singing Kumbaya together. You have to have somebody who can actually give reassurances for minority rights and reassurances that everybody's voice will be heard. Just one point. Erol did talk about, if only Bashar al-Assad and his family could get on a plane and go away, then the whole thing maybe could be resolved, or that would be a small price to pay. I know that there are a lot of people, a lot of my friends in the Syrian rights movement who personalize this in this way and say, Assad has to go and we're not going to negotiate with Assad. I don't think that's the way to get the people that you need to the negotiating table to come to the negotiating table, to determine who will represent the other side. I don't think the ANC would have succeeded in South Africa if they'd said, we will negotiate with anybody except de Klerk. We will negotiate with anybody except the National Party. You have to negotiate with the people who are in power, and you do so even though they have committed horrible crimes. In fact, one thing that I'm thinking is that F.W. de Klerk, wherever he is, could play a really useful role right now. He could go and talk to President Assad about the fact that there is life after minority rule. He's done a little bit of good writing in recent years. Just one last point about my experience in Lebanon and how that informs my view of the Arab League now. I saw in Lebanon in the 1970s there was the Arab League peacekeeping mission there. It devolved almost at the moment they hit the ground into each of the Arab brigades fighting against all the others in